everybody. Today, we're here to talk about design for a high-stakes environment with confidence. So speaking today is me, Ashley, then two of the senior designers at UE Group, Annie and Blair. So as I mentioned, we're from UE Group, but I also want to bring up that we are part of a sister company, Strut, which you may have seen around the conference, as we're one of the sponsors. So talking a little bit more about UE Group and what we do. So our focus is really humanizing technology for approachable experiences. So thinking about cutting edge technology and how we can make it so anyone can feel comfortable using it. We've been doing this for 19 years now. We've been around since 2001. And our process has been evolving since then, but it always keeps the truth of having a user-centered process. So really making sure that all of our decisions are based off of user needs, user concerns, and user behaviors. Our team is built out of many different types of roles and people, but looking at just your presenters today, so my background is in industrial design, while Blair's is in computer science and Annie's is in bioengineering. So very diverse, and we all each other's knowledge to make our products better. With that, we have done a lot of work in a bunch of different industries, and that is really a helpful insight to see what's going on and what are the larger trends overall, and helping us draw inspiration from different industries and different familiarities. So today, we will be talking through really unique challenges that come up in these kind of high stakes environments and how we use this process that we've been using for so many years to deliver successful solutions in these challenging situations. So getting started, first we felt like it was important to define really what a high stakes environment is. And to us, the way we define that is when the products you're creating are working with people or in environments where injuries are common and mistakes can be costly. So that can be costly in an expense format. It can be costly in an intelligence format or a risk format. So any of those ways, and you'll see that in different industries, kind of how it fits into that high stakes area. So I think the best way to describe what makes a high stakes product is really talking through an example. So this is work that we recently did for a product called SpineMap Go, which is out in the industry now. So this product is a intraoperative surgical solution to help make spine surgery more successful. And in this clip we're showing right here, we're talking to a scrub tech, and it's her job in the operating room to get all the tools set up before the procedure so the surgeon is ready to go. But that's pretty complicated. There's a lot of tools that she needs to know, and they're all set up differently. So she often relies on the rep of the sales rep of the different tools to help her get them set up. And that can be really challenging, and it makes her self-conscious because if she doesn't know how to do something and she has to keep asking the sales rep, she starts to feel everyone's eyes in the room, especially the surgeons. And she is concerned that the surgeon might be doubting her capabilities and doubting that everything's going to be ready for him in the surgery. So that adds a lot of stress to her job and makes it harder for her to perform and to perform well. So we took that inspiration and tried to echo it in the interface to help her out and make her life easier. And through this user testing, she had really shown us that we had been successful with this quote, "Where has this been all my life?" And the funny thing is, it wasn't the massive technology upgrades or anything like that that really did this for her. It was something as simple as the instructions on the screen. So this really shows you how critical a good user experience is in this kind of industries. And that's what we try and bring to the table and what we're going to try and teach you how to do in this talk. So this isn't just for medical industries. This also goes for many other industries as well. So one of them being military, making sure that, there's security and that you can find gaps in knowledge and things like that. For security, making sure that all of your devices are up to date and safe, and that the appropriate people are in the appropriate spaces. For database management, I mean, there's so many AWS systems out there now, SaaS cloud systems. If any of that crashes or your database isn't managed properly, that can be a massive error that can cost important data and client relationships. Shipping and receiving, and this might not seem as critical, but in some cases, shipping and receiving, if you don't get your order on time, it can be a massive issue. And then automotive, most people think of this as a consumer type of product, but in reality, if you have to think too much when you're working with a screen or something like that in the car, then you're distracted from the road and you could injure yourself or others. So this is definitely one of them that falls into this category. But really, what makes these industries different than your standard consumer product? And these are the main categories that we found. A big one is risk averse attitude. So, people that are working in these industries, they would rather have no change than have a change because change introduces risks. They know how to manage their products that they use now, and it might be a pain, but they know how to do it. So they are often risk averse. And this is something that Blair is going to talk about later to help you understand how to work with those risk averse attitudes. Another one is long release cycles. So long release cycles is definitely a unique challenge here because when you're designing a product, it's not going to come out in 6 months. It may take a year to 3 years to hit the market. So what you're designing now needs to be predicting the future, and it needs to be relevant after 5 years or 10 years. So it's definitely something to be considering as you're creating the design and designing for something timeless, nothing trendy. The next one is challenging environments, and this is something that you can see through the interacting in a car versus in an operating room. There's all kinds of factors to think about. If it's equipment people have to wear, if it's noise or distractions, or just your focus not being on the product, it's all stuff that needs to be considered. And then the final thing here is training required. So training will be needed for all of these industries and all of these products. And it's something that we consider as we're creating these designs. But it's also a crutch that's often used in this industry. We're not going to make that change. It's too much work. It's okay. They'll be trained on it. That is something that it's our job as designers and user experience people to push on that and challenge that assumption and really make things as intuitive as possible, even though they're in a complex environment. So the process to go through and design a successful product is pretty much the same as it would be for any iterative design cycle. The key difference here is that we believe it's much more important to focus on the discovery phase. This is where we can really understand the constraints, the environmental challenges, the use cases, and really the intense background that's knowledge that's needed to be able to do something successful here. So that's where the process changes for us, and we'll tell you more about that as Annie goes through the discovery process.
Great. All right. So diving into discovery, as Ashley had mentioned. So this is a very important piece, and it really kicks off your product lifecycle to be successful. So starting with constraints, you're creating expensive, long-lasting products that involve more effort and more resources. And there's a lot of different factors that you need to take in when you're designing for this environment. Some of those include corporate goals. So you might have short-term and long-term visions. You might have an initial release with follow-up releases coming after. So that's always something you need to keep in mind. There's also relationships to other products in the product family. There's an approval process within the company that maybe you need to get approval from managers, higher ups, VPs, and even presidents of different divisions. And then there's also that possible resistance to change where people are already comfortable with what they're doing and they want to continue down that path instead of kind of breaking the framework that's already happening and starting something new. When we talk about resources, we're really talking about time of the employees, the length of the project, budget, and then also access to users, which can be extremely difficult for these very specialized areas. And then when we think about requirements, this kind of breaks down into a few different areas. So there's brand guidelines following your companies or a company that you're working for, how they identify as a brand. Then there's regulatory guidelines, which we'll get into a little bit later, but this just means things like HE75 or being a certain level of compliance to ensure that different levels of users, whether they're colorblind or a certain regulatory for the operating room, that you need to make sure you're hitting those marks. Then there's also technical constraints where just the technology is bound under certain limitations that you need to work within. And then there's also dependencies on legacy products that you might be leaning on, and then time limitations where you just need to get the product to market quickly. So some considerations that need to be taken into account here is these high stakes create unique, challenging environments. So there might be strange lighting that can affect viewing. And then also you need to take into consideration the distance that someone might be viewing a screen. So specifically in the operating room, someone might be standing 6 feet or more further away from a screen. So that needs to be taken into account when you think about messaging, or even cars, or if someone's going to be touching the screen or using a different device to control it. And then you also need to think about the time to use this device. How long are they using it? At what moments are they using it? And we also need to consider the sound and distraction level, because that is a huge factor on the cognitive load of the user that they're experiencing at a given time. When we think about interacting with touchscreens or different kinds of devices, we also need to understand if they're wearing gloves, hearing protection, anything that might inhibit their immediate interaction with the device. And then a big thing that we found is we need to understand the procedural workflow versus the software workflow, which we'll get into here for an example. So this really just gets into how we need to learn the environment and the procedure. And the best thing to do is to see it yourself through ethnographic research or in-person observation. But that's just not always the case now more than ever with different restrictions. So I'm going to go ahead and talk through an example here for a surgical navigation interface where the procedure really needed to drive the workflow instead of the technology driving the procedure. So for this discovery process, we were able to visit 2 locations, and we reviewed 3 different sets of software for this product family. We spoke to clinical specialists, who are people that are in the operating room every day working with these surgeons and using the technology. And all of these helped us to learn the environment and the workflow that this is in. So we created this experience map shown to the right here. And so you can see here that we learned exactly what the procedural workflow was, and you can see down towards the third section of the screen where we mapped out the experience that the people using the technology were going through, and there's a lot of back and forth and jumping between different screens and modals, which required a lot of complexity and required a lot of training so that these people knew where to go to access different kinds of functions. And so as we, recreated this workflow and really started from scratch, we modeled the technology after the procedure instead of it being based on the existing constraints of the technology that had already been designed. So you can see that we reduced the complexity of the navigation, made it easier to learn because it matched the surgical workflow that was expected. And so we can see that, we have a much more linear workflow with different options associated at each moment when they would likely need those kinds of features, instead of needing to jump back and forth between different modals. So that was a big improvement for this product. So when we don't have access to our users, which happens, that's not a problem. There's still a lot of different ways that we can get this kind of information that we need from other resources. So we can go to product demos, we can interview with internal experts, we can attend training classes or even sales classes or for sales reps, or even end user trainings as well. Then there's a bunch of online resources. So you can access YouTube, or there's also this site called ViewMedi, which is kind of a resource for surgical videos and medical trainings that can be found there as well. You can also just do straight literature reviews for known optimizations. And then another great option is remote diary studies with similar user types so that you can kind of get in that headspace for them. So one example here is just to understand the environment when you can't visit people in person. So we had a diary study example where we were trying to learn about a wearable heart monitor process. So for this process, it is an out-of-box experience, and these instead of having this heart monitor put on in an office space by a nurse or a doctor, the company decided to create these home kits where they would send the kit to their home, and the patient would have to apply that themselves. But we wanted to understand what were the pain points, when were people struggling at different points. So we decided to do a discovery activity and had people go through this process and kind of self-report as they stepped through the out-of-box experience at each step. So with this kind of diary study mixed with the out-of-box experience, we got to see where people were doing this in their natural home environment. And then we also got to see the points in which they struggled and what areas could be improved. And so this helped us create a journey map there.
All right, well, now that you have a solid understanding of what the problem is and some of the constraints involved within the discovery process, you're ready to move on to ideation and start developing initial ideas. So one thing that's important for these types of problems is creating a visual language. So these systems can be very complex and can involve a large number of objects within them. And a consistent visual language allows users to assess the health and status of all of these objects at a glance within high-stress situations. So why create a visual language? So when we say visual language, we're referring to the visual treatment that's used throughout the interface to help users understand those key objects and statuses involved. And defining these objects up front creates these building blocks that in the long run can create an efficient, consistent, and scalable design. So in this diagram here, you see the purple dot representing an object. You could have different layers of information related to that object, and in turn that can be used within visualizations and then used within the overall design. So jumping into good versus bad visual language, just to give a quick overview of that before we go through how to develop a visual language. So first of all, it's great to have just well-known symbols, nothing too uncommon or too complicated. So for example, if there is a report as an object within your system, just having a very basic symbol to represent that. Using simple visual treatments that prioritize the most important status. So it is very powerful to layer visual data on your object treatment, but not making it overly complex in any way or showing too many details at once. Having it be noticeable at a glance. You don't want these objects to get lost within the rest of your interface with too many competing other UI elements or colors. And then consistency is really important here because as this is a form of a language, this is something that people need to learn. So having different treatments for similar things or any sorts of inconsistency will make that really difficult to do. So the first step in this process, just to break it down, the first thing you want to do is identify the key objects within your system. So some examples of those, like I mentioned before, reports or files. This could also include users or car parts or medical instruments. And then next you want to define what is the primary status and secondary status for those objects that you want to show at a glance. So to define the primary status, just thinking what's the main thing that users should know about each of these objects, and then are there additional indications that are important to show as well for the secondary status. So just to provide an example as we go through these steps, we worked on a cybersecurity interface that involved thousands of objects and used machine learning to plot these objects along advanced visualizations. So this was a very complex system, and we really needed to nail visual language up find the many objects in the system that you see on the left there, and use straightforward symbols to represent these. And then on the right, you can see how we started to develop the primary status, which in this case was risk, because this cybersecurity platform was all about identifying threats. And then the secondary indications included events that contributed to that level of risk. So some examples we're showing here are a bug or a download within those smaller icons on the side. And then the second step here is to combine these things together into a consistent treatment. So here on the right, we're showing an example of how you could show a primary status as the dotted line around the circle, and then the secondary status in the upper right corner. And one recommendation we have for this process is to create these treatments in grayscale first to accommodate vision impairments or unique lighting conditions, making sure that this is always going to be visible for people. But layering on color is also really powerful for quick recognition and high visibility of those statuses. So in this example here, we're showing this all thrown together. So all the treatments are uniform and relatively simple for the dense amount of information that we're layering on within this visual language. And then for accessibility compliance, one thing to point out here, in the risk treatment, status is communicated by the ring around the circle as well as the color. So we're reinforcing that risk level by the shape as well as the color. All right, and then the final step here is now that you have this consistent object treatment, it can be incorporated into various visualizations. For example, lists, diagrams, graphs, or anywhere else in your application. And in addition to just having this treatment at a glance, it's also advised to provide an additional straightforward way for users to understand the meaning of these treatments. So maybe that means you provide a legend as people are still learning the visual language, or if you select an object, it can spell out in easy to understand text what these indications mean. So just to wrap up this example, this is showing that visual language in the example here incorporated into different visualizations within this interface. So we have it being shown in lists and a relationship map in the middle there, and then different graphs. And then another thing we wanted to talk about within ideation is the idea of familiarity. So although we're working on very specialized tools in some of these industries, your users will always carry some background knowledge that you can leverage. So different user groups often have at least one piece of technology they're familiar with, and understanding what they're already comfortable with using will help bring that comfort level to this new piece of technology that you're working on. And this is really important because, as Ashley mentioned before, these stakeholders and users involved in these industries tend to be very risk adverse and fearful of change because there's a lot on the line to get this right, and they can be nervous of things that are too new. So we want to put them at ease with drawing upon what they already know by incorporating familiarity of existing products, technology, and experiences to increase that comfort level and lower the risk of putting out some. And so thinking about how you can draw from existing knowledge, you can start to think about what are these users already used to. So this can range from very basic everyday objects such as driving a car or using a microwave or another household appliance, or you could think about what are their typical behaviors and what do they use for entertainment. So maybe you could draw from playing video games or using a smartphone. And then also thinking, what is their comfort level? So how quickly do they pick up technology? How tech savvy are they? And also, how do they learn best? How do they quickly pick things up? So an example here is drawing from the tech use and learning style of military personnel. So in this example, we were dealing with a very unique type of user group. We were dealing with 18 to 19-year-old mechanic types that are working on jet maintenance, and they would be faced with stressful combat situations. And there's also a high turnover rate between these roles that they have in their environment. So they're frequently learning new processes and software within their job. So we really wanted to focus on what's their current tech use that they're comfortable with already and what is their learning style. So we did an initial diary study with a similar type of user group, as well as in-person interviews and observations on base visits with the actual users. And we found some great findings within this process that we were able to turn into inspiring our design. So one of those findings was that they're visual hands-on learners, seeing is for them, and they learn by doing things. So we incorporated this into the design by using representations of the physical world and 3D UI elements. So illustrating parts on the jet, using literal symbols for icons, 3D chunky buttons to make it really clear where to press rather than a trendy flat design in this case. They also had experience with video game and mobile app use. So thinking about how we can incorporate gamification with drag and drop elements, progress rings that are filling up, big check marks that appear, and just making things feel very sleek and interactive. And then they had a large use of hard copies and printouts in their daily work. So incorporating these metaphors within the digital space, such as calling things notebooks, to-do lists, and team binders. So benefits for your design with incorporating familiarity is that this can lead to quick learning and adoption. The more familiar something already is to people, the quicker that it can be picked up, and they'll be more inclined to adopt it. This just creates reduced training, learn, and a longer lasting product. So one thing that we like to use to get to a familiar product is drawing from seemingly unrelated things to come up with unique solutions that resonate. And as we work across different types of industries, this really helps us draw from those experiences to create unique ideas. So one tool you can use here is called analogous inspiration, thinking about what else does this well. So in this case, you want to come up with ideas based on factors of familiarity. So identifying what is the problem and then what else solves that problem that your users may already be familiar with. So this is an example, a real world example. There is a case where getting an MRI can be very scary for young pediatric patients. And it requires them to lie still on a metal bed, and it makes very loud noises that can be frightening. So thinking about what makes children feel more comforted. So in this case, they drew inspiration from kids getting bedtime stories and using that kind of adventure environment to apply that to this MRI machine. So on the right here, you can see that the MRI has been converted into a submarine. And there's even aquatic animals on the side there. They'll use noises in the room and make it really feel like a story that kids are immersed in, so that it's more of a fun, relaxing experience for them to get an MRI rather than something very frightening, which decreases the need for sedation.
Great. So I'm just going to touch quickly on some of those required guidelines that you need to take into consideration when designing for this space. So there's a few different ones. I just want to highlight, 508 guidelines for AA compliance, which is something that's required for all government style products. There is also kind of a priority that we need to focus on for high legibility and flexible navigation, and then also development priority for coding of the site to be assistive and program friendly. So there's also specific to medical the space HE 75 guidelines, which has very specific measurements for the button sizes and text to be read from a distance, and then also meaningful color use. And so a few tools that we use inside UE Group here is the one for Macs called Sim Daltonism, which helps you check for visual impairments. And it's a window that you can just drag over different design files just to make sure that that contrast is legible enough. And then there's also the color contrast analyzer, which takes in hex codes and then measures that contrast for you. Both are great tools to ensure that you're hitting those benchmarks. And then within UE Group, when we're creating our wireframes, we also have a UE Group cheat sheet. And this helps us stick to rules and maintain consistency across our design team, which helps us communicate with each other, but it also helps us communicate with other members of our company and other clients as well. So here we have different button sizes from minimum to a larger button, and also talking about the necessary spacing between buttons. And then we also have a very consistent color usage that we like to use, where it's just grayscale for our wireframes. We have special call to action and selected treatments, and then really honing in on only using the good, bad, and warning states for the moments that matter most. So while this process helps us achieve success when designing for these high-stakes environments, you can utilize these approaches for any industry, really, from complex to consumer, to create solutions that are user-centered and constraint-inspired and scalable as you look towards the future of your product. And so feel free to reach out to Ashley, Blair, or myself. We'd love to open a conversation and chat more about any design challenges that you're experiencing and hacks that you might be able to use to kind of overcome those challenges. And thank you for joining us today.